Hello, everybody. Welcome to What Would Your Ideal World Be? A new podcast which examines many important people and the important things in their lives, what they think about most current trends at the moment, what they think about certain subject matters, and of course, what their ideal world would be.
Today's guest is Rishi Fernando. He is a Conservative Party councillor for the St Mary's ward of Ware Town Council and has served in that role since being elected to it in May 2019. He has also served as the leader of that council since April 2020 and has served as the Deputy Mayor of Ware since May 2021.
Would always the case. How are you?
Fine, thank you. Yourself?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad.
And thank you for coming on.
No problem. Glad to join.
Fair enough. The first question I want to ask you, if you don't mind me asking, forgive me for using the colloquialism, so to speak. What was your red pill moment? What got you involved in politics in the first place, if you don't mind me asking?
So politics for me, I think I've always been interested. I think my mother's, to be honest. My mother's always been soft political, supported the local Conservative Party fundraisers. So I'm used to memories of sitting on the staircase and watching our local MP, who was David Burrows at the time, come round and give a speech, and started my interest from there. Then at school we used to get regular speakers, and then I've got involved from there really and went from that.
And was there any big time issues at that time that really you wanted to discuss or wanted to tackle that also got you involved? Was it mainly just sort of like the way that these people that you often encountered, like David Burrows and so on, taught? Was it just mainly them, or were there also any specific issues?
Well, no. So I think in terms of if it was a specific issue, the European Union, I've always been fairly pro-leave. I haven't always been a member of the Conservative Party. Only joined now. I think it's going back a few years. But I was supportive of leaving the European Union before the Conservative Party were talking about it. So I've stood outside Parliament and joined the campaigns. So I think that is, if you were asking for a single issue, I think leaving the European Union is probably the other thing that kept me involved, well, got me involved.
And one other thing about that is that we're both leavers on this side and so on in terms of like the European Union debate. Why do you think that being pro-leave, being anti-European Union in our sort of age bracket, if you don't mind me saying, or our generation, so to speak, is perhaps more of a rarity? Because if you look at polling from that time, I swear it was like 25% of our sort of like 18 to 24-year-olds voted to leave at the time and so on. Why do you think that is such a rarity as opposed to, say, like older generations, or maybe even say other young people outside in other EU countries, like say in some of these other countries?
I mean, for me, it's a tough one. I mean, because for me, I've always seen it as, and I know from a lot of my friends, a large percentage were pro-Remain, because there is a lot of advantages to being in the EU, free movement of people in terms of studying, going on holiday, things like that. There is direct, ease for people of our age that is important to them. But I think it's one of those that I think it depends on how you look at it, and if you think that the EU can be changed or made better. And I think a lot of people like to think that things can improve, but again, from my experience and my personal view was that it couldn't, which is why I was pro-leave, because I didn't think it would ever change in a way that was suitable.
And do you think the EU has only has gone since us leaving? Do you think that they've actually decided? Do you think they've gotten better or worse in terms of like sort of policy and so on, given the recent controversies in recent years, whether it be Article 13 or the stuff for the vaccine rollout on their end? Do you think it's only gotten more contentious among many people in Europe, or do you think more people are more supportive of it now than they were in terms of the European continent before Brexit?
I think it's a funny one that when it was to do with handling Brexit, I think Europe came together slightly. And then with the start of the pandemic, it brought Europe together. The vaccine rollout, I think, did not go down well for a lot of European countries, with the common rollout and also the individual countries' attitudes towards certain vaccines, AstraZeneca, for example. So I think EU cohesion has fluctuated quite a lot over the last 2 years, partly because of Brexit, but I think also the pandemic has shown that individual countries in a time of crisis tend to put themselves first and this common idea and this common good, whilst in theory is very good, it's very difficult when you've got a government that represents an individual country. They've got to think about their own country as well. It's not just about the European Union. So I think it's fluctuated, but at the moment, I think I would definitely say that the European Union hasn't come out the best over the past year.
Mm-hmm. And why did you specifically join the Conservative Party? And if you don't mind me asking, because you said you only became a member very recently, and why specifically did you join the Conservative Party, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, I mean, I say very, very recently. It feels like recently, but when I actually think about it, so I'm 26 now. I got involved in politics from about the age of 15. So for 2 years, I was a member of UKIP, and then I joined the Conservative parties after that. So it is actually quite a long while, but in my head, I think it's a short period. But again, it was just at the time, the Conservative Party weren't talking seriously about leaving the European Union. But I've always had conservative values. Part of that's from my family. My family is in business and I have a strong family background, believe a lot in, a government that's not top heavy, a government that enables, my mother came to this country as a nurse and was able to build a business and better herself and lift herself up. And those sorts of values is what attracted me to Conservatives.
Mm-hmm. And if you don't mind me asking, because admittedly, for full disclosure, I was a former member of UKIP as well, even though I wasn't a member nearly as long as you were. Like, what made you decide to leave UKIP? Was it because of what a lot of people leaving UKIP for the same reason, because of infighting and so on? And what made you decide to leave UKIP, if you don't mind me asking?
The reason I left UKIP, it wasn't any particular. So I didn't just go and cancel my membership. It just came up for renewal 1 year, and I thought, I'm not going to bother renewing it. And it was just that, again, I think Nigel Farage was talking a lot of sense, but it was just getting pulled in a few too many directions. And as you say, there was a lot of infighting, and it wasn't cohesive. And the Conservative Party had finally started seriously talking about giving a vote to the people. So it then made the most sense to join the Conservative Party, which is where my natural values lied anyway, and then campaign for it from within the party, because Conservatives could actually deliver on a vote.
Mm-hmm. And what is it like being a councillor for the Conservative Party? How did it feel getting elected? And how's it been being councillor for the last couple of years?
Well, so I first stood in my family home's from Enfield, which is North London. So I stood in previously once in North London. I was unsuccessful. And then I moved to Hertfordshire, a place called Ware, and that's where I stood again and was elected as a district and town councillor. And I think it's very different comparing a London unitary council to a Hertfordshire council. So obviously in London it's unitary, so it covers everything, whereas in East Hartson it's district council and town council. And I think, honestly, it's very rewarding, but it seems less like within the actual council, and I guess it's a stronger Conservative majority, so there is less of it. But even when you have an opposition, it's much less confrontive than it seems in my experience of Enfield, for example. So it's actually been quite nice, and we work quite well with the opposition councillors that are there, because at the end of the day, we all have that common value of wanting what's best for the district. Sorry, it's a difficult one in terms of because it covers such a wide area of things. Mm-hmm. And it's just a lot of residents, for example. So I mean, in Hertfordshire, the biggest issue that a lot of people raise with me is house building, because it's an issue that's across the southeast of England and wide further afield, is that local authorities need to build houses. People need homes to live in. But of course, it's never very popular when it's on someone's back door. So it's trying to get that balance right and making sure I sit on the planning committee, for example, in East Herts. And it's, I do my best to ensure that any application that comes before me is scrutinized and is an appropriate development so that it's fit for its purpose.
Mm-hmm. And one other thing I wanted to ask, you talked about a less confrontative attitude than you say that you had in Enfield. Is this relating to sort of like the controversies that have played sort of like the Labour Party in that area in recent times, where there's been a lot of people leaving, Private Eye keeps putting it in like the most Western boroughs and stuff like that? Is it all that sort of stuff which has been alleged? There's some that's been alleged, some that's been confirmed, and so on. So may I ask, if you don't mind me asking you, what is that sort of attitude like, and what is it like working with those people?
From what I hear, because again, I'm not a direct councillor, I'm not a councillor in Enfield, but from what I've heard from councillors and people involved in Enfield, from both sides, is that the current Labour administration, the group, are not socially inclusive, and there is factions within the Labour group, which is disappointing. And as you say, there's been resignations, by-elections, councillors that are standing as a Enfield, as a community, they've stand under, I can't remember off the top of my head now, but there's a group of councillors that stand under an independent banner now. So I think, and that's why I think having an opposition is quite healthy, be that whatever political party that is, because when you have a strong majority, it can lead to issues like this. Whereas when you're having an opposition is that sort of checks and balances, which can be quite healthy.
Mm-hmm. And one other thing I wanted to ask you, what is it? You are the Deputy Mayor of Ware, if I'm not mistaken, and you're the leader of the Ware Town Council. What's that like, really? What's it been like to have this sort of positions of power? What's it been like? And yeah, what, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, so thankfully now, as we start to come out of restrictions, it means that we're able to start having a few more in-person events. So as Deputy Mayor, I support the Mayor, which this year is Councillor Ian Kemp. So, for example, tomorrow I am assisting with judging the allotments. We have an allotments competition that we run annually. So, you know, at Ware Town Council, we cover things that people notice on the street. So, for example, Christmas lights. So last year, we funded additional Christmas lights, including a Ware Bear, which was very popular because we felt it was very important that with the pandemic, you know, things that brought people to the high street, things that gave people community feel were very important. So it's things like that which actually, from a town council level, really does sort of work to bring the community together, and it's something that the whole community can enjoy. District level, you know, when we make decisions at district level, it can cover the whole of East Hart, so that's Hertford, Bishop Stortford, Sawbridge Worth, all of those areas. But at Ware Town Council, it is, you know, the issues that the things that we're deciding on. For example, at the moment we are funding. We've allocated funding, and we're crowdfunding as well to try and increase the pot for a new skate park in the Ware Priory, which is going to cost about £150,000, and the amount of interest that has from local residents, people our age and younger, that are very excited about that project and getting involved with its design. And it's actually quite heartening to see that community spirit that's still there.
Mm-hmm. And one other thing I wanted to ask you about, that you talk about lockdown and the restrictions being lifted. How challenging has it been to workers in those roles since the pandemic began, since the lockdown began? How challenging has that been? And what's it been like to be in these roles during these sort of unexpected and difficult times?
At the very start of the pandemic, it was difficult because obviously, being a councillor, everything has always been in person. You know, all committees, everything, and suddenly it's this shift to online, which has never been done before. So the first few months was strange because there was a lot that needed to be done, but at the same time, it was hard to get things done. So local authority, you know, council officers stepped up and put in a huge amount of work to ensure that services were still being delivered. But as a councillor, so I was, you know, it became more of a community role for councillors to get involved. So I'm also a volunteer for the Hertfordshire Fire and Rescue Service. So I was involved through them during the pandemic, doing what I could. I was reaching out to people that I knew of that were vulnerable or elderly in the community, checking in on them. So it was about that community outreach, which and just doing what we could in the middle of a pandemic to make sure that we were supporting people and still accessible to people in uncharted times. But it has been a strange year, I will say that. And the amount of Zooms, you're on mute and the likes of it, which everyone is now used to. I just wasn't expecting it when coming into 2020.
Mm-hmm. And is there anything from sort of the arrangements from pandemic times that you'd want to keep, or you're planning on keeping, or do you just think get rid of all of it in terms of sort of like the way the council does things in terms of meetings and so on?
Well, so I think that online meetings, the benefit obviously of an online meeting is, so I work as well, and a lot of other councillors work, and sometimes getting to a physical meeting after work can be challenging. Trains aren't the most reliable, traffic, all sorts. So actually having a hybrid approach could actually be quite a good thing, because I think anything that encourages younger people into becoming a councillor is only a good thing. And I think having a hybrid approach would work, because it would mean that people that work in London or further afield wouldn't have to be travelling back to Ware or Hertford as often. So I think a hybrid would be something to look at. The legislation, of course, at the moment has expired, so it's back to full in-person meetings. But I hope that national government, when the pandemic is over, will look at it and see whether there's something that can be done with that.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about meeting sort of young people and encouraging them to become councillors. What is talking to, say, younger people about politics like? Especially there's this stereotype, some of it true, some of it may not be true, about a lot of young people being, very left-wing, being sort of supportive of people like Jeremy Corbyn and so on. What's it like talking to those sort of people? And are those sort of stereotypes true, or is it just, exaggerated?
No, so I think from what I've found is that people with more left-leaning values tend to speak louder than those with conservative or right-wing values at our sort of age. I wouldn't necessarily say that there is more of them, but it's just that they tend to speak up a bit more. People our sort of age, if they do have conservative values, tend to keep to themselves and don't talk about politics as much. It's been so, and I mean, that is one of the things that has been difficult, because with the pandemic, it's not been possible to reach out in the way that I would have hoped to. One of the things that we just started doing just before the pandemic kicked in was to have regular events at pubs or other social events that people could pop in to meet some of the local councillors and have a chat about anything political or not, any local issues or politics. And I think it's one of those that, for me, I've always been of the attitude that being able to have that conversation is the most important thing, because you will always agree on something, even if you are Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem, Greens. At the end of the day, there will always be something that you can have a common value on, and it's finding that common value and understanding why someone feels the way they do or disagrees with the way I have a lot of friends that, coming back to Brexit, that it's also a lot of people our age, as you say, were more likely to vote Remain. But being able to have that conversation with them is actually quite interesting, because it shows you how people see things differently. And I think a lot of people are receptive to hearing other views. And I think the media narrative doesn't help, because the media will just constantly tell you that everyone that our age votes Labour. And I don't believe that's the case. And I think the thing that needs to be done is that we need to, as a Conservative, I want to speak to as many people as possible and engage with as many people as possible.
Mm-hmm. And one other thing I wanted to ask you on that is, if this is too much of a blunt question, I apologise. Like, what do you think of the current state of, say, the Conservative Party now on Boris Johnson's leadership? What do you think of that? If that's a bit too much of a question, I can't answer for reasons. Then,
I mean, that's obviously quite a broad question. I mean, Boris Johnson, we've had a global pandemic that no one could have predicted, and I don't think anyone quite expected things to end up the way they have. And I think Boris Johnson has done the best that he could do given the circumstances, along with the Chancellor. I think, if you look at things in the media story recently, then I think, we do need to be a bit more careful about optics, because, there is an image of Conservatives, us and them. And I think that's something that we still need to work on, because we don't always get the optics right. And, the pilot scheme is an example of that, where the Chancellor and the Prime Minister announced they were going to be part of the pilot scheme, and then 4 hours later retracted from it. And I don't think things like that are helpful, because the media pick up on it and then turn something that isn't that big of a deal into a big deal. So I think that's where we need to sort of just focus our efforts slightly. But, I think the furlough scheme, everything that's been done by the Conservative Party under Boris Johnson's leadership, we have genuinely done everything that people, more than people thought we even would do, to support people during the pandemic.
And one other thing I wanted to ask you about that is that, what do you think, if you don't mind me asking, of sort of the revelations that Boris Johnson's former number 10 main guy, Dominic Cummings, said on BBC yesterday? Do you think he's trustworthy or not in terms of what he says, especially because of a lot of the other scandals he's been involved in? Or what do you think about that, if you don't mind me asking?
Dominic Cummings is highly intelligent, but I think yesterday's interview, so I've not watched the whole interview, but I have watched parts of it. I was busy yesterday. But I do think he comes across as slightly arrogant. And I think the general public, since last year, his reputation and his importance has gone downhill. I mean, all I can say is, on the doorstep, very few people have brought up, or talking to people, very few people have mentioned Dominic Cummings to me. A lot of people now, it's not necessarily don't pay attention to him, but sort of, they know he's got a vendetta with the government and with Boris Johnson. So I think they're not surprised when he comes out with some of his comments that he's made. I don't think he's done himself any favors. He talked a lot about transparency, but then he hasn't always been the most transparent himself. So it's one of those that I think, if you're political, you can read a lot into it, but to the general public, personally, I haven't seen that the general public are that affected by the sorts of things that Dominic Cummings is coming out with.
Do you think it might be a problem with the media sort of concentrating a lot on him? Like, I'm not like, it could be a problem of them being so focused on, say, Westminster, that they could just be focusing on him quite a lot just because he's formerly part of the government, so therefore they just give him airtime because of it, as opposed to him what he has to say being of substance, perhaps.
Oh, well, no, look, he had a big, you can't deny he had a big part to play in the Vote Leave campaign and the most recent general election campaign. Those are facts. But the fact is also, he fell out quite badly with Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party. And, someone who's got a vendetta is not going to be an impartial source of evidence or impartial source of information. So I think the media can spend as much time as they want promoting him, but it does get to the point where, and I think we're at that point now, where the general public just don't pay significant amount of attention to it. And actually, there is far more important things to be talking about. And now, as we come out of restrictions and into a return to a sense of normality, I think, quite frankly, people don't really care enough about what Dominic Cummings is saying. What they care about is, can they go on holiday? Can they start going out again? Can they have can weddings restart? Those are the things that people care about, not what Dominic Cummings is saying in a TV interview 1 year down the line.
And what does the Conservative Party, do you think, and the Conservative government at large need to do in order to have a successful bounce back from the economic woes and from this pandemic, to get back to that sense of normality? What do you think it needs to do? What steps do you think need to be taken to get us back to that point of, say, pre-March 2020?
Well, I know at the moment the Conservative Party, there is a big levelling up agenda that is being promoted across the whole of the country. The government is well aware that as we now, they've supported people during the pandemic as much as was possible, but it's more than that now. So, there's free ports coming up. But a big part of the problem is that a lot of these projects take a long time. there was electrification of railways, which funding was given in 2010, but it was only completed in 2019. So I think what the Conservative Party are trying to do is that balance of, there's a big recruitment drive for police officers at the moment, because that's an issue that is close to people's heart, crime, and having that visible presence of police officers. So the party has a broad vision which they are trying to achieve. I think but again, it's been difficult the past year because the pandemic has just taken up so much time and has been such a huge issue and of big financial cost, that I think, not everything that that the Conservative Party would have liked to have done, say, a year or 2 years ago, is necessarily possible. But it's about ensuring that, across the UK, and not forgetting about London and the southeast, because there was the disappointing result in Amersham and Chesham. The government is very aware that there is a need to have policy and an agenda that works for the whole country and not just for a part of the country, but about balancing it, because where Labour have taken red wall seats, for example, for granted, the Conservatives don't take any part of the country for granted and truly believe in levelling up across the country.
Mm-hmm. And beyond the, getting our lives back to normal after the, with all this being, getting to the end of it now, what would you say are the big three issues that this Conservative government should focus on, do you think? Like, what do you think the big three issues our country faces, now? What do you think that they should be focusing on after all this pandemic stuff has been sorted and worked out? What do you think are the main three priorities for the Conservative government now, do you think?
So if you mean complete, so if once the pandemic is finished,
once we've completely, sorted everything out in terms of this sort of stuff, what do you think the main three priorities of this government should be, do you think?
Well, one of the things that does need sorting out is the Northern Ireland Agreement, because that is something that we don't want to see a return to conflict or a breakdown in relationships like has been experienced in the past. So I think that's something that is very important, and I think the European Union have a large part to play in that as well, because I don't know if you've seen, there were some articles that came out today as well. The current solution is not working, and it needs to be relooked at. So I think in terms of urgent matters, I think that is something that will have a genuine impact on people's lives and community cohesion. I think one thing that the Euros, obviously disappointing, not that we didn't win, but it was quite nice to see the country coming together and to see that there is that community spirit. And I think it's building on that, which the Conservative Party need to do. And a lot of that is now. So, for example, with the police and recruiting 20,000 new police officers, and investing in schools and education, because the Conservative Party have always been strong believers in a strong education and a strong, not strong police force isn't the right word, but in law and order. Mm-hmm. And I think with past governments and cutting the budget and cutting the deficit, not cutting the budget, cutting the deficit, I think public services like the police, have been impacted, and the government do see that, and are taking steps now to actively change that. And I think number three is housing, because at the end of the day, people like you and me, we need somewhere to live as well. And there is, unfortunately, houses have been going up, but not in the numbers that are needed. I mean, London, for example, is a prime example. It's a slightly complex one in London, because obviously you have the Mayor of London that's in charge of planning policy. But I think he's built something like a 10th or a 12th of the amount of housing that he promised to build under his term. It's just simply not enough. And I think and this is why there is currently a discussion going on about planning reform, because in terms of things like brownfield sites, in terms of, and I think we need to think outside the box, because the opposition, the Conservatives don't want to build on the greenbelt. The Conservatives don't want to concrete over fields, unlike, some political parties will try to tell people otherwise. But the Conservative Party understand that houses need to be built, and I think this planning reform will be a very important part of that, to ensure that developers are building houses and properties that people actually need. Because a large number of bedsits, for example, is not what people need. You need the 2 beds, 3 beds in the small houses, and that housing variety. So I think if the Conservative government can do something, and they are doing a lot of work on it, but if they can really push that through, and work with developers and planning policy and local authorities to deliver on those housing needs, I think that will play a huge part in the future of this country, because home ownership is so important. We need to move away from generation rent, because renting will always have a place in the market for some people, but if people have home ownership and have something that they can call their own, I think it's a very different mentality, and I think it's a healthy thing to have in society.
Mm-hmm. And on that sort of stuff, on the things you talked about, if you don't mind me asking, this is too dense a question for me to be asking you, a councillor, then please forget, you don't have to answer it, but you talked about the Northern Ireland Protocol and stuff like that.
Yes.
What do you think the solution may be to that? Because I remember reading an article by Melanie Phillips, if I'm not mistaken, where she talks about one solution could be to have, like they have in the US and Canada, where they have frictionless trade. Do you think that could be the answer? I mean, I'm not particularly well knowledgeable on this. Just what do you think?
So but this is the thing. I can't proclaim to be an expert on it, but I can simply see the tensions and the fact that it is an immediate issue that needs sorting. There's highly more qualified and specialist people working on it than me, but it does seem that the current system is not working as it had hoped to be, and something needs to be done about it. I'm not. I know there's been a few different options bandied about, but no, I'm not a specialist enough to have my own solution for it. But I think it will require give and take from both sides, and I do hope the European Union are willing to engage with us on it, to ensure that what something we can reach something that works for both sides.
Mm-hmm. Another thing on the topic of housing, do you think like a threat to all the house building that the Conservative Party is going to do is the threat of, say, certain like multinationals buying up a lot of property, turning it into rents, for example? Because you see in America, BlackRock buy a lot of property to turn those houses into rentals, or I think John Lewis are doing the same in this country. Do you think that might be a problem in terms of that, or do you think it's mainly just an American problem?
So my understanding in terms of John Lewis specifically is that they're looking at converting, because they own a lot of property, and they're looking at converting and redeveloping some of the existing sites there, because the retail sector is changing. There's no two ways about it. There's, with the pandemic especially, there's a huge shift online, and the high street is changing. You don't need shops don't need as big a presence on the high street. So I think, schemes like that where you maintain an element of retail and housing can be quite good things, and I'm quite supportive of those. Obviously, individual circumstances apply, but broadly, I think the idea of it, I'm supportive of. The Conservative government have identified that there is a need for home ownership, and that's why they incentivize. There's been a stamp duty holiday for, I think it's up to the first 350 or £500,000 on any property purchases for first-time buyers during the pandemic. There is surcharges for anyone buying any more than one property, so you pay an additional surcharge on stamp duty, so it de-incentivizes it. There will always be markets, and as you will always need rental properties. So I'm not against the concept of buy-to-lets. I think they have a place in the market, but it's making sure that the new homes that are being built are affordable. Because I think the biggest issue is not, you do get private equity firms and the likes buying up properties, but I think the biggest issue is that the homes that are being built aren't necessarily always the ones that are needed for society. They're either too small or they're too expensive. And it's building something in the middle, which is what people can actually afford on people's salaries. And I think, but again, this is one of those, but I don't know how you necessarily solve that. But, you do hear cases of people where they can't get a mortgage for a monthly payment that's less than the rent that they've been paying for 10 years because they don't have sufficient savings, or they don't have. So, the system's not perfect. The government has taken steps to, move to try help that. But I think there is probably more that can be done. And yeah.
And you were talking about like the opposition earlier. I'm assuming you were playing the Labour Party, but just for reasons, it's just You talk about the Labour Party. Do you think it is possible that they could ever, in the future, win a majority government again? Because there is all this, controversy about them. Also, the fact that they, in the most recent by-elections, haven't done particularly well, especially them losing Hartlepool in particular.
No,
And
so Labour at the moment are in a difficult place, and when you have a large membership that is so split as they do, it's always going to be difficult, because they're ideologically quite divided at the moment. There's a lot of infighting. I know I read recently that a constituent Labour Party, the chair and the two deputy chairs, both resigned in protest over Keir Starmer. So they're in a very difficult place at the moment, and trying to sort of identify what they are and what they stand for. But it is a strange time politically. The Conservative Party have won 4 general elections. We won the Hartlepool by-election, and we came very close to winning another by-election. That came to a few, I think, 350 odd votes.
yeah,
So the Conservative Party is in a very strong position, which is very highly unusual for a party that's been in power for as long as we have been in power. But I think that's testament to the fact that people can see what the Conservatives are doing, that the Conservatives are working for them, and the Conservatives genuinely are doing what they can to support the individuals. And I think there's, I think I have noted, I've campaigned quite widely and quite far across the country, and you are starting to see, and I think Brexit has had part to do with this, where Brexit became a sort of right-wing contract, which I never quite agreed with, because I didn't believe it to be a right-wing contract, because actually a lot of the people that were supportive of Brexit were, for example, ex-miners, working class, people that had been in industry from generations. And I think the Conservative Party is appealing to them in ways that people have. Labour no longer represent them, which is, people have always said, well, Labour represent the working class and Labour represent the majority. And I think people have realised that actually Labour don't necessarily represent them, and Labour don't quite know what they're representing themselves. So if their own political party doesn't know what they represent, then how can they be representing people?
Mm-hmm.
So I think, in 2024, when we're during the next general election, unless Labour have really sort of got their act together, I think they will struggle, because if you had an election tomorrow, I think, I'm pretty confident the Conservatives would be returned as a majority party.
Mm-hmm. And on that, do you think why do you think it is that after all these defeats on their side that they still, I don't want to be too, sort of arrogant here, but they haven't really sort of listened to their core vote? Because if you look at, say, their Instagram feed, for example, which I know is a weird pick, they're putting messages on there which seem to be not particularly favorable of free speech, or such as say stuff like immigration. They seem to be very sort of tone deaf to a lot of what their voters want. Do you think a lot of it, why do you think they're still sort of not interested in discussing this? And do you think that Paul Embry's description of them, him himself being a Labour Party member in his book, that them being an organisation comprised largely of urban middle class liberal students and social activists, is accurate?
Look, I mean, I don't know enough about the membership to comment on the accuracy of that statement, and I wouldn't want to upset people. But Labour saw a massive increase in their membership under Jeremy Corbyn, and that was with quite left-wing ideologies. Labour under Tony Blair was very different to what they stood for under Jeremy Corbyn, and I think Keir Starmer has been trying to play a balance of trying to find that middle ground. I don't think he's been as successful as he would have liked to have been, and I think by trying to reach the middle ground, he's not appeasing either side of the party. So he is in a hard place, and until he's able to get a form of cohesion, I think, as you say, the Labour Party is split between those who are the new Labour and Jeremy Corbyn supporters, who were quite left-wing and quite socialist in some of their views. But I think the Labour Party have found, and Jeremy Corbyn found, that actually the country doesn't necessarily have an appetite for such strong socialist values. Jeremy Corbyn offered them to people, and at the ballot box they said no thank you. So whilst the membership can try to push whatever principles they want. But if the country has voted quite decisively against those principles, then I think Labour really need to sort of have a harder look in the mirror and think about what they stand for and whether they do represent people. Because if they're going to stand on those principles, then actually they don't represent everyone, and it is the Conservative Party that will represent the majority, not Labour.
Mm-hmm. And I hope you don't mind me being a bit cliche here, but do you think that it's possible that Keir Starmer's like this generation's Neil Kinnock, so to speak, if you know what I mean, in the fact that he's trying to sort of recobble a party that's been, very badly beaten. He's just trying to sort of get, return to sort of like a more, I'm not sure you say it, a more appealing version of the Labour Party, do you think?
I think there is an element to that that is what Starmer is trying to do. I think the pandemic probably hasn't helped, to be honest. It's been a strange time for everyone, and quite frankly, I think Labour found themselves in a difficult position because they found it hard to criticise the government, because the government, went beyond what Labour were even calling for in terms of the furlough scheme, financial support packages, bounce back loans. The Conservative Party have done a lot to financially and to support people in this country. And I think Labour have struggled with that because it's left them in a hard place where they're not quite sure what they should be supporting and what they should be opposing. So I think the next year will be interesting to see what happens with Keir Starmer. I think the fact that they were able to hold on to the by-election will give Keir Starmer a little bit of breathing room. And let's see whether he's able to sort of pull the Labour Party together, because I think that's also part of it. The parliamentary Labour Party is very different to the membership of the Labour Party, and I think it's trying to, at the moment it seems a bit like a square peg round hole scenario, and it's whether those can be rounded off to work together. Because, there is, as I said earlier, I do believe in an effective opposition, because I do think you need checks and balances. And I do think, a democracy requires an opposition, because any political party should have an opposition to hold them to account. And, quite frankly, Labour haven't been doing a great job at that.
Mm-hmm. And this will be the final question about Labour, or I'll try to anyway. Is that, do you think there's any current Labour MP that you think could actually turn them into more effective opposition again out of the current crop they have, or do you think it's busted flush at this point?
No one particularly jumps out at me. I know a lot's been said about Angela Rayner, but again, I don't know whether she's necessarily the right candidate. So no, I think in my opinion, there's no one that comes to the top of my head that I think would be an obvious replacement. I think Keir Starmer is highly intelligent. He ticks a lot of the right boxes and has the right potential. But I think, if someone like Keir Starmer can't bring the Labour Party together, I think anyone's going to really struggle to bring the Labour Party together.
Mm-hmm. And on that, do you think the Conservative Party conference going ahead this year, are you planning on going? And if so, what do you think it's going to be like this year? It'd probably be very different given all the sort of stuff that's going on.
Yes, so the Conservative Party have announced that the Conservative Party conference, they're taking registrations now. It's going to be a hybrid event, so members will be able to attend virtually as well as in person, should they choose to do so. I think society needs to start to get. Society is reopening, and I'm planning on going. And I test myself regularly anyway. Through work, and I also, you can get the free lateral flow devices, that you can test yourself with regularly. I think finding that balance between personal responsibility and living your life. I've been vaccinated and I've had COVID, so I'm fairly confident that I can go out and live my life, and I would hope that should I catch COVID, I won't be affected by it. And it is promising to see that. Whilst infection rates are going up, hospital rates are still very low. And I think if we can maintain, about that balance, then I think events like conferences there's nothing wrong with them, and I think they should be going ahead.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I've going as well. I've also been jailed and stuff like that. Personally, courtesy of Bill Gates, of course, and that's a joke. And one other thing I wanted to ask you, if you don't mind, is that Who would you say were your influences in terms of like political thinkers and leaders, if you don't mind me asking? Like, who would you say your biggest influences are when in politics? Like, who's really inspired you the most, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, so I mean, in terms of on a grassroots ground level, Nick Dubois, who was MP for Enfield North at the time, I'm a big fan of his. I've always thought he was a very good MP, and it's a shame that he wasn't in Parliament for longer. David Burrows again. I mean, Nigel Farage is someone that I can see the smile there. I've been out campaigning with him, and you have to give it to him, whether you like his policy or his personality. He resonates with people. So there is something about Nigel. Actually, I haven't. Again, yes, I was busy, but he started his new segment on GB News, which I saw was incredibly popular. So it shows that there is, the population do resonate with him. But then in terms of if you're looking back more sort of historically, my mother's always said, and that's where it comes from. I think under Margaret Thatcher, she was able to build her business. Her policies were supportive of entrepreneurs and small businesses. So I have a lot of respect for Margaret Thatcher as well.
Mm-hmm. And one other thing I want to ask you, because you brought up GB News, I want to discuss that very quickly because our hour's nearly up. Is that is there anyone? I hope you don't mind. Is this a too controversial question? You can pass it if you want. Is that? Do you think there's anyone on our side that actually is a little bit of a troublemaker that you don't like? Not necessarily in the Conservative Party, but just generally on the right, so to speak.
You mean on GB News specifically?
No, just generally. Sorry, I was going to bring up GB News' next question.
In terms of too right wing, there's no one that sort of immediately jumps to my mind. I think again, as I said, optics is something the Conservative Party need to think about, and we haven't always quite got it right. But I think this applies to across the political spectrum that MPs, ministers, shadow ministers, they are held to a higher level of accountability. And I think sometimes we forget that they're human, and they forget that the positions they're in as well. And the pandemic has brought out the best in people, but it's also highlighted that humans are imperfect. So I think there's that. But no, I can't. Off the top of my head, there isn't any one particular person that I would say is too extreme.
Yeah. And what do you think of it, GB News so far, then, if you don't mind me asking, given that it's supposedly the British answer to Fox News and all this sort of stuff? What do you think about it so far, especially given the seemingly rocky start it's had?
Well, look, we've not had a new British news channel start in, I don't know how many, but, in recent times, you've not had a new British news channel. And to start up with a fairly small team is not an easy task. And I think they have had teething issues, and there's things that they can improve on. But I think the principle behind it is very good, and I hope that they grow it from strength to strength. I think that is it 18 hours a day they want to have worth of content.
I think that is. I'm not completely sure
about but it's a significant amount of time that they're planning on being on air, and to come from nowhere, and set up a brand new news channel is no easy feat. I think one of the things that I think that they could improve on or expand on is panel discussions where it's not just right-wing commentators, because I think that's one of the things that is slightly missing, where there's not necessarily enough of a debate that's occurring. So I think that's something they could look at. But apart from that, no, I do really hope that they grow in numbers and grow in strength.
And how poorly does it speak of the rest of the general media that GB News is needed as seemingly as an alternative to a lot of the mainstream networks, which are perceived as being either biased or, say, against a lot of the issues people care about, according to many people? Do you think it speaks very poorly of sort of like the current trends in modern mainstream media that it's had to actually come to pass at all, do you think?
The media is always a difficult one because good news stories don't sell in papers. It— headlines are headlines for a reason. And I think especially in politics, it has seemed, but it's a difficult one because if you ask someone on the left, they'll say the BBC is right wing. If you ask anyone on the right, they say the BBC is left wing. So no one is ever going to agree over anything. Is I think the main point. But I do think that, it's just, I can't say I'm surprised that something like GB News is needed. But I do think that, these large news corporations that have existed for so many years have got slightly lost in their way. And sometimes, the bigger picture's not always been apparent. And that's why, if GB News can, seek to be an alternative and show them that, how things are running is not necessarily just because things have always been done that way, for example, showing that things can change and they can be for the better. So I think it's quite healthy in that sense because times change and society changes.
And one other thing I wanted to ask you about GB News as we final question on it was that the fact that there's been some rating issues apparently in terms of like terrestrial networks and so on, as opposed to online where it seems to be doing quite well, where it gets like hundreds of thousands of views. Do you think that indicates that maybe TV networks in general and, sort of like old sort of ways of consuming media, whether it be, newspapers and radio and so on, are sort of like floating into the background, so to speak, as opposed to sort of like online stuff, where it be like alternative media sources online or just general sort of media anyway online? Do you think that's sort of the way of the future? We'll see sort of like the other modes of consuming media sort of expire at one point?
I don't know if you necessarily ever see it expire, because I think they do have a place, and they do have a place, and there is still a large number of people that will watch it. But personally, I consume news pretty much predominantly through my mobile phone, because I'm out and about. So if I'm on the train or when I have a spare 5 minutes, I'll be reading. I'll pop onto a news article or I'll go online to get my news. I don't necessarily sit down, put the television on, and watch the news. So I think there is, and I'm definitely not the only one. There is definitely a massive shift towards that. So I think just taking it on terrestrial viewing numbers are not necessarily the most accurate. Even if you go, YouTube, for example, you get some very popular commentators and podcasts that happen, which have significant numbers of regular viewers. So they all have a part in society, and it is a generational change, and it's a change in society where technology is becoming more apparent. So yes, I think GB News, as an example, whilst the terrestrial numbers may not be as high as the traditional media, it all has to be taken into account because people are consuming media differently, and I think I don't think they'll become extinct, as you say, but I do think but it's the same with print media, that a lot of it's print media is reducing in numbers, but digital media is increasing. So it's much the same in that.
Mm-hmm. And one of the final questions I'll ask is that in terms of like reading and stuff like that, is there any like British media commentators you enjoy reading on a regular basis? And the stuff like that, if you don't mind me asking, or is that just
there's I read quite a wide variety. Well, I like to think I read quite a wide variety. So I'll read anything from the Guardian, the Telegraph, the Times, through to some of the more what's seen as right-wing media. I'll take information from online, from YouTube, some of these podcasts. So I don't think there's any one particular in person that I would necessarily read from. And I think that's just what I find important, is that being able to have that breadth of sources where you're getting information from. And actually, I think just taking information from one particular journalist or section of the media can lead you to think that, can influence you one way or the other, whether that's representative of what the national society mood actually is. So no, I don't think there's anyone in particular that I sort of regularly read. I'll read everything, basically.
And the penultimate question I wanted to ask you, if you don't mind, is that this is the title of the show, and I ask all my guests who come on, what would your ideal world be?
Ideal world?
Yeah.
Well, if we never had to talk about COVID again, that would be quite a good start, I think.
Thanks, China.
Look, I mean, where it came from, and I think this is one of the things that COVID has obviously been around for a while, and it's shown us and highlighted that society is vulnerable to these sorts of instances, and it's shown the best and worst of humanity. In an ideal world, I think for me the core values have always been a strong education, strong society. I have quite strong family values, and strong defence, but also and I think this conservative levelling up agenda is something I really agree with, because for me I've always believed in a hand up, not a hand down. So a society that works to encourage and better people, but also support those when they need support. Humans are humans. We're not the same. We're never all going to agree on everything. It's just unrealistic to think that. But I think it's building a society where you're able to make something for yourself no matter what your skills are, is I think what my ideal world would be.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for coming on. And if people wanted to find out more about you or your work or your role in the Conservative Party, the Conservative Party in general, just where can they find you on social media? What links do you have, and what social media do you have?
So I'm on Twitter and I'm on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. On Twitter and Instagram, my handle's Rishi F_94. But others, if you just search for Councillor Rishi Fernando, you'll be able to find me. And anyone wants to reach out to me, I'm always happy to have a chat with anyone.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for coming on, and have a good evening.
Thank you for having me. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and share this video, as well as subscribe to the Ed Interviews YouTube channel, and also the Ed Interviews BitChute channel, and also look at my stuff on Mixcloud as well. I'll have more of this content coming in, and also subscribe to my Patreon subscribe star as well for more guest requests, as well as free copies of my old books. Until then, see you next time, guys.